Today, I want to talk about the moment. Now, that's like a pretty hard thing to do. What even is the moment? I'd like to put forth today an argument that we're living through what I call a causal syzygy. If you're like me and grew up in the early 2000s, then in every Nickelodeon cartoon you heard about stories where when the planets align and celestial alignment happens, then some big cosmic event will occur, like the unleashing of a demon. The actual technical term for when astrological bodies align is called a syzygy. I think syzygies are very, very auspicious events, not literally, not actually when you have a syzygy. It's extremely rare and doesn't do anything to affect us, actually. But I think metaphorically, they actually do represent something that is a almost definitional auspicious time. See, when planets align, what that actually is referencing is cycles, and the alignment of several cycles all occurring at once. So, for instance, right, the length of a year on Venus is actually quite different than the length of a year on Jupiter. And so, for these two planets to align, it actually has to mean that they are in a sort of weird coincidence where this one thing, their yearly cycle, happens to be divisible by some similar factor. There's something deeper underlying this change. I think there is a very easy and maybe uneasy awareness of the fact that we are actually living through what I might call somewhat of a causal syzygy. Several different civilizational level changes are all occurring simultaneously. And unlike the cartoons of our childhood where this could be represented as one penultimate crescendo before the big battle, what I actually think this sounds more like is jazz. I don't think that our particular causal syzygy is going to be recognized as a single crescendo-like moment in which the world is forever changed. I think that, in particular, our different fundamental changes actually have somewhat different cyclic feels. I don't know if there's actually a technical word that I could use here, but what I'm trying to describe is certain things, like presidential elections per se, are quite sharp in their transition. There is a clear point when one president stops and another president begins, where other types of things kind of feel more like numbers, if you're familiar with them. Numbers that can be confused with other numbers, like the number 2 is confused with the number 2 and also the number 1. There's actually a very precise technical definition of what that means. In fact, here's a great video on that if you want to check that out. But I think that certain types of changes, there you can mark a before and an after, but only in this broad chunk of time. In other words, another way to think of this is the change itself, the intermediate period, is like a real phenomena. And so, putting this together, I think we are living through several different types of civilizational changes, which I will go through one by one. I think each one of them has somewhat of a different period, like a different length of this change, not in terms of how long it takes to change, but how frequently we see changes of this scale and magnitude. And then, finally, they each have a different duration of change. This is what I was talking about earlier, where something like a presidential election has quite a short duration of change, where something like climate change actually has quite a long duration of change. And what we are experiencing is a causal syzygy where several of these things are lining up all at once to cause mass civilizational change. So, I've laid out what a causal syzygy is, but I haven't told you what's actually changing. I think before getting into that, we should discuss another concept first, which is the concept of a civilization stack. This is a concept thrown around in really nerdy circles in San Francisco and maybe a few other places, so I feel like it's not that widely known, and as such, it's definitely worth popularizing. A civilization stack is a thing that people on the right wing talk about a lot, and people on the left wing oftentimes take for granted. It is the set of moral and cultural foundations that allow a culture to work. So these are quite different in East Asia than they are in the West, than they are in Africa, than they are in the Middle East. Each culture, each civilization, has slightly different parts of the stack changed, which end up making the culture that culture. So for many people in the world, the civilization stack is something like religion, which includes in it several other parts of the civilization stack, such as gender norms, such as morality, and ways of thinking of what one should do with their life, how one should live. On top of that lies oftentimes a structure around how people should relate to each other and fundamentally the state. So this is Confucianism in East Asia. This is specifically Sharia in Islam and people who practice that faith. And in Christianity, this is very, very easily summed up with the verse, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto the Lord what is the Lord's. And so from religion and then the state, you bubble up even further into how people think about work. And so in a place like medieval Europe, this might be guilds and apprenticeships and the passing on of one's trade to one's son. In East Asia, this can often take the form of a very intense sort of filial piety, bringing honor upon one's family via working quite hard. This also, another type of incarnation of this in East Asia is how the practice of Confucian filial piety even comes into the workplace and how people think about managers and hierarchy and seniority in a company. Whereas in a place like America, people think of work as fundamentally something that says who they are. People identify themselves oftentimes first with their job. I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I work in X. And as such, the American work culture is quite distinct from the European work culture, in which many people in Europe, a job is what they do, it's not who they are. And so you can start to see how parts of the stack intertwine with each other. This is where things like the so-called Protestant work ethic really come into focus, and you can start to see how different cultures, truly due to very deeply rooted cultural differences, actually approach very fundamental aspects of what it is to live quite differently. Now that we have that out of the way, we can go on to talk about what's changing and how this interacts with this civilization stack. One of the things that I want to say up top before we get into what's changing is that change isn't necessarily bad. Some changes are good, some changes are bad, but all of our institutions are built on somewhat unchanging ideas about how the world works, who is liable for what, who has the right to do what, and that when these things change, certain core assumptions of the institutions no longer make sense. And due to institutional inertia, that causes them to lag behind in efficiency and effectiveness, and eventually causes them to no longer be able to perform the function that we created them for in the first place. So, what's changing? Well, to start off at the bottom of the stack and try and work our way up, the very, very bottom, fundamentally, our climate is changing, and that is causing different types of economic pressures that we haven't yet dealt with. Moving up one more, the way humans today interact with gender is fundamentally unprecedented and quite new. Moving up again one more, the people today are markedly less religious than they used to be, and this is causing social division. Moving up one more again. On top of this, we are currently going through a Thucydides trap causing global conflict between China and the US. Moving up again. This is all happening amidst the greatest media revolution that we have seen since the printing press. Finally, this is all happening in the midst of the greatest economic transition that humanity has witnessed since the Industrial Revolution. There you go. That is the set of changes that I perceive that we are all currently going through as a human species. This is very interesting, and I'll go through each one of them one by one over the next however long this video is, talking about what's going on, which institutions are being affected, why it's causing problems with those institutions' core functions, and what one might be able to do about it.